Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight for another Innov8 speaker session. We've got a great speaker here with us tonight. Let's jump to our next slide, Danny. I want to see if what we've got on here. Yep. So quick intro to Zoom. Don't think we have to do too much of an intro to Zoom. Probably most of us have had quite a bit of a taste of that by now. But you know, we always include this here. You guys know how the screen works, and we'll move on to the next one now, Danny. So I'm Timothy Summers, your host tonight, Executive Director of Cloud and Advanced Network Engineering Services and Third Horizon Initiatives at ASU. Actually happy to see some members of the Third Horizons team on here. And we're gonna, Danny, take us forward on a slide because I'm ready to just jump into talking about you. So we've got Danny Zuckerman here with us tonight. He's a co-founder of Ceramic Network and 3Box. And they're focused on creating a more connected and trusted infrastructure for the web. Danny's also the co-author of Identity Theft. And you know, he's previously led strategy and operations at Uport, built award-winning products at Zern, and worked as a strategy consultant with Bain & Company. So Danny, thank you so much for being with us tonight and just, you know, spending this space time with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. And thank you for the very warm introduction. And so just open invitation to everyone to jump in with questions as you have them. Would love to stop and talk about any of the points that you want to dive deeper into, or you have questions about trying out a bit of a different narrative here. And so excited to talk about it with all of you. What we're going to talk about today is identity, which is, as Timothy said, something I've worked on for a very long time in a few different ways, and how I and my team view it as really the key to bringing digital society into its democratic age. So let's jump right in. We already covered my background, so I'll throw up the contact info again at the end for anyone that wants to get in touch with me. Just a couple quick words about Ceramic Network, which is where I spend most of my day with my team. So Ceramic Network is an information management protocol for the open web. We'll talk about more of what that means. What it is at the lowest levels is a content network that is persisted not by any one institution, but by peers, by anyone who wants to participate, for publishing, linking, querying, verifiable data. So information you can trust, information that has high integrity because you can see the signatures, you can see the cryptography, and you can choose how it's being persisted. You know, it's a kind of data management layer at the very bottom, but decentralized identity management is really built into the core of it. It's really one of the main reasons we built it. And so we'll talk about how information management and identity, in my view, really relate to each other very closely. They're not separate pieces. They are together the key to kind of the next phase of the internet. So that's what we're about at Ceramic, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So 3 parts to this. And again, feel free to jump in with questions because we'll pause at the end of each part to talk about anything that's come up. So the first, the web is our digital society. And this is something that you kind of see all over in tweets and articles, but by this I actually mean something very concrete about how our society in the past has progressed from age to age. And I think if we do accept that the web is our digital society, that has some implications for how we think about how it should be managed. The second section, tech empires rule the web today through their control of its information. And I think we're used to seeing articles again about abuses of data and some of the power that very big tech companies have, but I want to walk through how I view their kind of rise and what's driving it, because I think to understand that is key to understanding how we can move to potentially a better web going forward. And the third, which I'll try and get to quickly, because I think that's where the kind of real forward-looking interest is that new information identity technologies, things that really are just coming online now, by now I mean like this quarter, this year, are, I think, the key to letting us reclaim our web. So those are the 3 sections, a lot to cover, but I'll try and go relatively quickly through the first few, but again, jump in with questions as you have them. So let's do it. Oh, sorry. So mostly to make sure that I know how to work the polls, because I never have before. Let's start with one. How many of you were at Drummond Reed's SSI talk 2 months ago? And let me launch this. There we go. Cool. It looks like about 50-50. The reason I ask is we're going to talk about some very similar concepts. We work with Drummond and Sovereign, and frankly, he's led the way on a lot of things. Frankly, we've learned quite a bit from him. And so we share a lot of the same goals, a lot of the same views, but also we take a bit of a different approach. And we see identity a little bit differently than he does. And so hopefully this can be a bit of a good reminder of some of those concepts, but also a good kind of contrast and juxtaposition to some of those. And you can think about what resonates with you and what you're seeing in your own worlds. And this poll. Okay. So let's dive into part one. The web is our digital society. So taking a very macro lens here, civilization previously, and by the way, let's not consider anything I put on slides here a in-depth history lesson. I'm simplifying pieces, but generally we can think about civilization having gone through 3 ages before digital technology: the hunter-gatherer age, the agrarian age, and the industrial age. Those were kind of the 3 very large phases of civilization. Within each of those ages, there were 3 political phases. By political, I don't mean the way that we think about it today, but I mean the way that society organized itself and kind of who had decision rights and power in the society, how it was organized and making decisions generally. The first is the settlement phase. So this is early on in an age where things are much smaller scale, much sparse. The age is kind of just being explored, characterized by pretty rapid development, pluralism, freedom, and generally a very exciting time. Then that progresses into empire building. And we'll talk about why, but this is consistent in each age. And then as the empires get untenable, either revolution or a technical external revolution tends to break up the empires, or sometimes a combination of the two. So to make this a little bit concrete, this is kind of, so the reason that these phases happen is because each new era introduces a new dominant resource. That's one of the reasons these eras change, is there is now a new key resource to organize around and to build power around. And so in the agrarian age, this was property. It was the first time as societies moves from hunter-gatherer, where you're constantly on the move and killing what you want to eat that day or gathering what you want to eat, to much more sedentary farming. Property had value in a way that it didn't before. And so this brought returns to scale, and over time, those who built up more and more property were able to amass more power, and this led to city-states and feudal lords. And this kind of persisted and grew until the Industrial Revolution and citizen revolutions. Industrial Revolution was a new era, and what this really brought to the fore was not so much property in the form of land, but capital, and the ability to deploy capital in more and more meaningful ways and on a global scale. And this led to the rise of bankers and multinationals and nation states as really the nexus of power and the empires of the age. And what I think, and what I think is, at this point, not so controversial, is that digital technology has ushered in the information age. And I think we sometimes think of ourselves at the beginning of this, but it really is a major shift in not just how we're organized and how we communicate, but I also think in how we should think about the political structures of today. I don't think it's a stretch to anyone on this call to talk about the web as our digital society. On the left, you kind of see amount of time we spend online climbing significantly every year. This continues. We do everything online. We talk, we meet, we share, we shop. we game, we even go to music festivals online now. Everything that you would consider a society to be home to is now done online. So next poll. Let me see if I can, here we go. So if we are in the information age, if the web is our digital society, what political phase do folks here think that we're in? So some split, a little bit settlement, a little bit democratization. I hope that the latter is true. I think we're on the cusp of it. About 50% of you say empire. And I think that, and I think the title of this talk or some of the previews may have hinted what I think we're in, but I think we are at the tail end of the empire phase of the digital society. So let's look briefly at how we got there, or got where we are today. So first, we had the settlement age. Look back at the kind of 80s, 90s, the early days of the internet. Free for all, huge proliferation of startups, of blogs, of internet forums, of failed startups. So just a massive, not even a land grab, but just a massive flocking to establish new products and services and capabilities online. What in the early 2000s and then especially in the mid 2000s, this is just one example. There are many, many other data points you could look at. There was just a massive consolidation. So this graph is showing traffic and basically how concentrated traffic is. This is just a change from 2007 to 2009. And so the red line is showing kind of the distribution of traffic to the top, 10, 30, 60 ASNs in 2007. And you can see, if you look at the distribution just 2 years later, it's climbed at a lot of points, somewhere between 20 and 30%. So it's really rapid consolidation. And I think the question is why? What enabled that? And I think we're at a point today where we really are, that has continued, we really are dominated by a few large tech empires. So I'll come back to that question again, one more poll. What resource enabled today's tech giants to consolidate these empires? And we'll walk through this in just a minute. So they had lots of advantages, many things you could look back to and point to as reasons they were able to grow and consolidate. But what do you think is really the driving force behind it? Cool. So bunch of votes coming in here, pretty split across all of these. See, 10% to 20% for basically everything besides traffic. And I agree. I think that's really a lot of self-reinforcing loops, which we'll look at. But let's dive in and see at least one view of kind of how we got from such a sparse settlement age and a very kind of decentralized internet early on to where we are today. So part two, tech empires rule the web. And my thesis here is that it's through their control of information, which I think about 20% of you thought as well. So settlement era, abundance of applications, lots of different projects and products and services doing lots of different things, each with their own users. Also each running their own infrastructure. In the 90s, software as a service and kind of cloud everything didn't exist. If you wanted to start a company and do things online, you ran your own infrastructure. You got servers, you hooked them up, you made sure they were up and running. As that happened, some of these businesses found success, talking about enterprise and consumer here. And I'm again oversimplifying this a little bit, but it plays out kind of with tweaks in a lot of different segments. So some of these found success and they got big and they had to get really good at running infrastructure. And and they just were already doing it. The marginal cost of doing it a little bit more wasn't much. And so they started offering their efficient infrastructure to others, and others could build on the infrastructure they were already running. And so now this is the 2000s. Now it's easier than ever to start a product online, to start a service. You don't have to run your own infrastructure. You don't have to worry as much, at least, about you have some success and now all of a sudden you need more servers. You need to manage that load. You can, you don't have to do as much upfront to invest in your own capital, your own servers. You can get started more easily than ever. And this makes a lot of sense. It's efficient. It's exactly following the model that worked throughout the industrial age, leveraging scale to expand and specialization. But we're not in the industrial age. And so I think something that some people foresaw, but most of us weren't as tuned into, started to happen. And so I think to really understand what happened, we should look at what this infrastructure was that was being offered by some of these larger tech companies early on. And it's easy to think of infrastructure and talk of infrastructure as the hardware and the servers and the massive data centers, the connectivity, but that's really only the lowest level. The other infrastructure, and by infrastructure here, I mean, what does it take to get your application, your product, your service up and running that supports the actual application, that supports the core business logic that you want to be delivering to your customers? It's more than just hardware. And on top of hardware, you have to decide, a lot of applications are basically just, interfaces and views and queries on top of data, pulling different types of data and showing it to you in different ways to let you interact. And you have to have a data model. You have to figure out how you're actually going to show the right information to the right users at the right time. Then you have to store that data in that data model. And then you have the app logic and the interfaces that actually deliver this to your users. And so just to take one example of what I mean by this, so it's not quite so abstract. If you go to a website and you log in, and when you log in, the application shows you your profile, you've already gone through some pieces that used to be very hard. The sign-up flow and the authentication to keep track of which user is which and make sure they have the right password, and then to use that password and tie it to the right profile information and make sure it's encrypted and secure so other users can't see that. All of that was part of building a data model and storing data before. And companies that had built up massive networks of profiles, for example, Facebook, could now offer that as a service. So now if you're an application, you don't need to do your own authentication model. You don't need to manage that part of the flow. So this is what in many, many different ways, some of the larger tech companies started to offer to others who want to get started. Now it's much easier. You just have to build your app logic and you can take it to market much faster. And so if you look at what's being offered a little bit more holistically, to some degree, the hardware, but especially the data model and the data, I think we can think of this as information management. That's what these companies started to do more and more for others, not just for themselves, but for others on the web as they became information managers. And I think it's really important to know that this is not just about they're collecting as much data as possible, but they're also basically dictating what data models get used everywhere. And so this is one diagram, what it looks like for any given application. You've got your application layer. Again, down here, you've got your kind of data plane below that database, but you've also got the kind of control plane, the in-between middleware that really is what controls the different pieces of your data model and logic. And so these information managers, these large tech companies, are controlling the control layer for all applications. They're making decisions about how data gets managed at a huge scale. So they did this for a reason. For the most part, offering cloud infrastructure is now a huge business, but that wasn't, a SaaS business wasn't what all of them were after. Offering others this free to build on data model and offering them information management was great for them. So it really is the key to driving their own flywheels and their own growth, which is really just the start. So this is, some of you may be familiar with the blog Stratechery. This is lifted from there, but it's a very simple diagram of Google's essential business model. And the data and information is at the heart of it. So more data drives both the user side, their ability to deliver better user experiences, more products, more integrated products, more users, more clicks, more attention, more results that feeds on itself. But also on the other side, some of you guys thought it was attention that was driving their dominance, and advertisers, again, self-fulfilling wheel with data at the heart of both of these pieces. It's what lets them continue to basically outstrip any competition. And this doesn't seem that pernicious at first. They found a good business model, good for them. Others can do the same thing. But that's not actually true in the information age because of some new dynamics in how information is managed. So first they grew through their own scale. They made it cheaper, they made it better, and they really cornered the market on information management. This means they also not only kind of have the relationship with all of these apps and products and services, but also with all of their users. But what really made it so unstoppable was the network effects they were building. And so this makes it so it's really not true that good for them, anyone else can go do the same thing. They just built the best business model. So we talk about network effects at a pretty high level very often, and we're not going to go through this entire slide. This comes from NFX, which is a venture firm built on understanding and investing in different types of network effects. And they've gone really deep to understand the different types of network effects that exist and how they differ. Because we use network effects to basically cover everything that implies, if more people join, the value of the network goes up faster than linearly. That's like kind of network effects at the very highest level. But not all network effects are created equally, and you can stack them to make them more and more strong. And these large companies have built network effects at basically every level. And the closer you get to the center, the harder it is to overcome. And so what I'll point out, again, lots of much better articles than me talking to if you really want to dive into this, but the one at the center is physical. Physical network effects is laying the actual cable lines for internet or for phone companies because it's, there's such a high upfront cost and there's so much benefit to more people being connected to the network that can't be replicated. It's nearly impossible to overcome that. And any physical network effects you can think of more or less are regulated for that reason. It's not a fair market. And if you look at Facebook and Google and these large tech companies, they have all of the other ones to a huge degree, and they're working on the physical ones. Why are Facebook and Google launching blimps and planes to deliver internet access and to do these very far out things? Well, because they can drive not just a new service, not just because they can, but because they're always trying to increase the advantage that they have through network effects, and that is kind of the next one for them. And so this is not a new, talking about network effects isn't new, but also just there being this new driving and in some ways surprising vector for control is also not new. This is the trend, I think, in how empires gain their dominance in each new age, because each new age brings a new key resource, and that key resource has a different way to kind of aggregate power around it. And apologies for the somewhat scary images here, but like the agrarian age, again, the new resource there was property. And with property for the first time, plunder, and there was really a way to, like, what was a concern and was a way to actually like accumulate new property. And so there was now power in protection, and those who could offer protection could extract huge amounts of, for example, the farming crop. And so you had the rise of knights, you had the rise of city-states and castles and feudalism, because protection was this new valued way to accumulate property. Moved to the industrial age, and that changed a little bit. it's capital, which is a different than physical property, that was so valuable, and capital benefits so much from scale. The more scale you have, the more efficient you can deploy the capital, the more you can amortize the upfront costs of any capital. And so the monopolists of the industrial age were able to grow massively beyond anything else because of this. And this is, I think the canonical example here would be Walmart, a mom and pop shop trying to compete with a Walmart. And I think network effects are basically this for the information age. They are the way that huge companies entrench their empires and their power, and they are as hard to overcome as these previous dynamics. They're not just a good business model. They are this dynamic that we all underrated. And so why does this matter? So they're empires, so what? So I won't pause too much here. You probably are all familiar, but I don't think you have to look far to get overwhelming evidence that these empires do abuse their position because they know they can't be displaced because of their network effects. I think the way that they treat data is the obvious example, but even just the business models and the way that they interact with their partners and with their users. This is, I think, a great chart from, I think, Chris Dixon that he basically calls the attract-extract model, which is early on. There's every incentive to attract as many users as possible, get them on the platform, but the more network effects you have, but the more they've actually invested into your platform, the more you just start extracting from them. And so it is an extractive model at its core. But more than this, I just think we can truly think of them as dictators over our digital society. We can't really opt out of the web, and we can't really opt out of using platforms and applications that are built on the data models and the information offered by these large tech companies. It's incredibly hard to do. But they also know that they can't be competed against, and so they can really dictate, how that information management, how those applications work. And they do, and they, again, just a few examples here, but they decide what third-party apps and features make it into the place where we have our conversation about politics. They don't decide that based on what's the best conversation about politics. They decide based on what's going to drive the most profit. They have to legally, but we can't opt out because of the power of network effects. And they internally shut down the efforts that kind of shine a light on this. And you kind of see even just the decisions about what applications and products are going to exist in the future. They have so much power that they can actually just decide, no, I'm going to go kill that application. I'm going to kill that competitor. They do that over and over. It limits it limits who can participate in our digital society in a practical way. And so we are kind of living in this digital society on this playing field that we can't opt out of. We can't choose to go onto another one. It's network effects make it too hard, but it's not, a flat surface. It's not a surface that we control. It's one that's designed to funnel more power to them, more money to these empires. Again, not really faulting them. They did a good job building their power to where they are. And they still contribute a ton in a lot of ways. So I don't mean this to be they are evil, but it is not a sustainable model for the web going forward. Okay, so I think that's where we are today. That was a lot at once. Hopefully I didn't jump past too many things or lose folks, but we'll pause here. So that's where we are now, and we're going to start to look forward. Do we think that empire, there's more and more public pressure and public opinion and antitrust kind of directed at some of these tech empires? Do we think empires trend towards more fairness or more extraction over time as kind of public opinion and other things start to swell up against them? See, almost 100% for extraction. Cool. That is some votes coming in still, but that is overwhelming. I think 93% for extraction, and maybe quite the leading question, but yeah, I agree. And then one more here. So if we think that's the case, and we think they're just going to get more extractive, what do we think typically will bring about the transition from empires to more fair distributions? And so the options I've put here are tops-down reform. So this is, from government reform them, bottoms-up revolution, or new external factors. What do we think is most likely to bring about that transition? Cool, more even here. About 60% for new external factors, and then 20% each for tops down and bottoms up. And I don't think that there's a single answer here. I do think that it can really come from a combination of these two. So before I jump straight into part 3, which is a bit different, I'll start to talk about some of the technology that you've heard about the last 2 months that we're building and that I think can really make a difference here. I'll pause. Are there any questions that folks have had? I haven't been watching the chat, but either in the chat or that people want to voice now.
Danny, and the only question we've had so far is about making the presentation deck available for further study and reference. That's it thus far.
That is an easy one. Yeah, happy to share it or publish it wherever you guys will put it.
Absolutely, we will definitely provide that. So thank you for asking that question, Mark. So Danny, I think we're good to jump into part 3. Yeah, let's keep it going.
Cool, let's do it. All right, so reclaim our information, reclaim the web. So I think that should be our goal, to get back to a free and open web. That doesn't mean it'll be the same as in the settlement era, but to a web where we have open participation and what we often talk about as permissionless innovation, and where we have a digital society that is governed by the users and constituents, not by a few corporations. So how do we get there? So here's what I don't think will work. I don't think expecting them to reverse course will work, as 90+% of us just agreed. I don't think that we can rely on tops-down changes like antitrust and regulation and just general public angst. I think that those may help, but if we look historically at at what happens after regulation, it actually tends to help incumbents. There's some very interesting lobbying going on around regulation online today, and we just saw Facebook change positions on some important points, because they kind of know that things that are bad for them are even worse for smaller companies. Marginal improvements to the current system, data dividends or privacy controls, they're not bad, but I don't think that they get us where we need to go. I also don't think any future path can ask new businesses, startups, to give up economics. If you're a new business, you have to find a way to survive and to make money. That's reality. I don't think we can ask users to give up convenience, at least not very much of it. Despite everything I've said today so far, basically everything I use is Google. It's incredibly helpful day to day, and people aren't going to opt out of that. But I'd say those might all be obvious, but I think the biggest thing is fragmented approaches without network effects aren't going to get us there. If information is the dominant resource and network effects are the ways that it becomes so powerful and how you protect it, we have to compete with the network effects of large companies with network effects of our own, I think. We need to be able to give the same convenience, the same economics, and even better network effects. And so I think that's possible. If we can deliver this infrastructure that we've come to rely on some of these large companies to deliver, and if we can do it in a way that delivers even more powerful network effects, then we have a better alternative to the web of today, where we trust these large companies to manage our information. And the good news is there's plenty of room for improvement on how information is managed. And so now I'm talking not on the kind of whole web view, but just for any given application, for any given product. Your information management, again, remember at a very simple level is, the physical servers, the data model, the data. And how do you actually manage data? Like, how do you actually truly manage the resources and the files across locations and across multiple people and across edits? So this is a chart from an awesome article from the Ink and Switch Research Lab called, I can't remember the full title, but it's local first is the term that they've given to kind of their line of research. And one of the authors, Martin Kleppman, who's a researcher at Oxford, has also given presentations on this. And I think this is his diagram. And it's just looking at some of the principles you'd want out of a data model and like a database. And those are on the top: fast, multi-device, offline, collaboration, so the ability to have multiple people editing together, longevity, so you can count on it, security, so it's not compromised, and user control. And user control, again, we'll talk about more, but really important for interoperability and portability and privacy and a whole bunch of other things. And you can see kind of an analysis of some of the apps and data management models that we have today, and very few of them do that well across all of these. They all make compromises, and at the end of the day, some compromise will always be necessary. There's certain things that just are inherently opposed, but if we can achieve these with new models for managing data, then we'll have a better data management system to offer new applications and developers and users. And that can be kind of the way that we start to build a better information management model that scales. So what would that look like? What would that require? So I think a solution that kind of meets those standards needs to offer convenient, cheap, reliable, and flexible storage. So at the base level, the storage mechanism has to be comparable or better to kind of alternatives. It needs high integrity, provenance, updates, versioning. So as you change the data, or as others change the data, you need to be able to see how that happened, trust that the latest state of the data that you're pulling, that you're reading on your application, that you're relying on for your usage is true, and know where it comes from. You shouldn't have to worry that it's been tampered with or trust others to take care of it for you. And there should be open, distributed, and direct management, which means, we're trying to get away from this model where we have trusted these huge companies to manage it for us. We trust that when we interact online, the data gets saved into Firebase DB, that they haven't done anything on their servers to tamper with that data. We're just trusting them. So, they have no reason to right now. But in a new model where more people are participating, we don't want to have to trust any one node or one participant to manage it properly. We need direct management of it. We need this to be open, so it's not gatekept and aggregated by any one institution or one person for that matter. The really good news is we have a lot of the primitives that enable each of these three things. So this is quite new. So storage, there are a number of distributed file storage protocols out there. The one that I and many others are most excited about is called IPFS. It stands for Interplanetary File Storage. I think blockchain gets more buzz, but distributed data protocols and systems have as much to offer as blockchains for a more decentralized kind of physical infrastructure for a lot of what drives the web. For high integrity provenance and updates, so blockchain, starting with Bitcoin and now many others, really do provide kind of a leap forward in, and this is true, I guess, of kind of other cryptographic technologies too, but in trusted information and the ability to have that trusted information in the public domain where it can't be tampered with and persisted in a really dependable way. And then open, distributed, and direct management, you've heard about it the last couple of months, but self-sovereign identity and moves towards self-sovereign identity and decentralized identifiers as kind of a core primitive. give us a way to start to directly author and manage pieces of information. And I think that it's not just identity information, it's all information. It's everything that's on the web. And so it's really about putting these together. And so I'm going to talk a little bit, there's lots of folks that are working on pieces of this. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing at Ceramic and with some of our partners, because what we're really trying to do is put all of these together, not in a super monolithic way, but in kind of a very flexible middleware mechanism, so that anyone who's building an application in any way that they want, any user using applications, can draw on these new technologies and some other related ones to have a decentralized way to manage information, to have a direct way to manage information instead of trusting the centralized model. And so we think of it as open information management for the open web, and it really is this middleware that can sit between users and and applications and other data sources that actually house information like blockchains and servers and even your like local devices, and just connects them all. It provides a kind of really dependable way to manage information between all of these previously very siloed servers, or very siloed pieces. And so I'll walk through what this actually looks like at a high level. And so we're going to go piece by piece. So you can think of Ceramic as a document storage data web. And so it is an open, so like anybody can use it, general purpose document-based storage network. So document-based is like a MongoDB database. But we say data web instead of database because it's not a database for any given application. It's a data web that anybody can participate in and link to. You can store public or private data, so encrypted or not. So you might want your username to be public, but you might not want your email address to be public, so you would encrypt that, so that can still be stored there. And each document is basically a series of signed updates. So you have this kind of local doc chain. So every new update that goes onto this data web has the signature of the person who put it on there, or the identity to put on there. So you've got verifiability of where it came from. You've got mutability because you can keep updating it. So that's quite different than, for example, IPFS. We've built kind of a layer on top of that. You can see the change history, so you can kind of audit and understand how data has changed. And because of that, you can also have versioning, where you reference a previous version and you don't have things breaking. So again, this is kind of coming back to the data model, like how are you depending on any given application or use case to power your experience. And so this is a really flexible and powerful way to do that in an open and general manner. So okay, these are documents. How are they actually stored? And they're stored completely peer-to-peer on any number of nodes. Anybody can run a node. And the nodes choose which documents to watch. So unlike a blockchain node, which typically would watch every update, here the atomic unit is a document, and nodes just choose which documents they want to keep track of. So applications could run a node keeping track of the documents that relate to their application. Users can run a node in their browser keeping track of the documents that relate to their information. Infrastructure providers can run a node that kind of are much more scaled for the network and are rewarded for that. But they can choose, and they can also choose how they back up the documents that they're watching. And it's a very flexible configuration. But really importantly, not every node is keeping track of every document, and not every node which means not every node has to agree. And so state, so the latest version, kind of agreement of what is actually the true version of a document, on a blockchain that's done with global consensus, which is the kind of primary reason that blockchains don't scale very well. They are hard to get kind of very high throughput. Here, it's actually the document itself that enforces state transition rules, that enforces kind of like what new updates are allowed. And so it's a local first model, which means it doesn't need to scale to the whole network. It just needs to scale locally first and then can propagate out to the whole network. And so you have a much more scalable and flexible model here. So there's this data web, but we don't think all information is going to be on this data web. That would be kind of not very realistic to say, okay, stop using these these servers and these databases that have proven themselves over years, or even these blockchains that have really valuable use cases, or these cloud services. Like, all of those should still house information of certain types, and they will for a long time, because Fortune 500 companies are all built on them. But these documents don't have to just contain self-contained information. They can also contain references. They can point to other endpoints, other servers, other databases, and they can contain metadata about those. And so the goal isn't to create this one network for information. Just like if we kind of look at other tracks of the kind of decentralized tech movement, I don't think there's going to be one solution for identity, or one blockchain where all assets live. But we do want to have a way to make all of that information interoperable, to be able to route to it, so that you're not fragmenting certain types of information on one network and other types on another. And so by putting pointers on Ceramic and documents to a database and describing it, now a new application, a new user can show up and know that it's there, discover it, request access to it, and go to that endpoint. And so you have this routing in a much more universal way, even without putting everything on to Ceramic. And I think that's really important, because again, the way that we're going to build solutions that add more value and are better than today's is through network effects. And so the more information we can collectively connect, the stronger that will be. So you've got these updates. They go first into kind of the local document, and then every update to a document is kind of batched, and this can be done in a lot of different ways, and anchored on a blockchain. So put into a Merkle tree, and the hash is taken and stamped onto. Right now, in our implementation, we have a service that's stamping updates onto the Ethereum blockchain, but it can be done in kind of infinitely many ways, infinite different frequencies on different blockchains. Nodes choose basically what blockchain they want to use. And so this gives really, really strict timestamping, which we'll get to why that's important later. But like a lot of guarantees about the information that you're pulling from the network being accurate as of a certain time, that you're not pulling old information or false information. But again, it doesn't rely on that for the storage of information, just for providing this verification and timestamping. So much more scalable. And this is where I think the title of the talk was about identity, and this is kind of the background that I and my team comes from. So each document is owned by a DID. And so I think Drummond talked to you guys about DIDs, decentralized identifiers, spec for interoperable identifiers across these different networks. Think of it as like a kind of personal URI. And so every document is owned by a DID, and that DID can not just write updates, but encrypt updates, access control updates, mutate the updates. And so it's direct management. If you have documents that contain your profile, or you have documents that are pointing to your databases, or if you're an application and you have documents defining your data model or pieces of your application, your DID controls that directly, and you're the only one who can update that. And so it's, again, a different model than today, where you might build an application on top of Firebase and a whole bunch of data goes in, but it's not being like signed and directly updated by the user, even by the application. It's happening through the kind of Firebase instance. That's not the case here. It is direct management by the participants in the network to manage information. And so what is identity to us? And I'll pause here. So again, kind of on the left here, like, identities are authoring information. Like, does that mean everybody needs a DID, and what DID, and like, how does that actually work? Because that is, if we're asking everyone to manage information directly, like, there needs to be a method to do that. And so to us, identity is a flexible graph of connected information. And it needs to be done in a really trusted way, which means there's lots of nuances and challenges to make this happen. But it doesn't, to us, look like you have a single one password you use for everything. It doesn't look like you have a blockchain key that is the way that you sign every update. It also doesn't look like you have an identity wallet, whether that's kind of a standalone app or Apple's identity or anything else, where you accumulate lots of different information and sign credentials to it. We think that's kind of a model that that just kind of takes the previous digital identity paradigms and tries to recreate them with better tech. Our view is that identity is much better seen as a generative thing that is your different information and pieces of data and credentials and personas, because each of us does have many personas that accumulate over time, and giving you kind of an in the background natural way to map them all together and use them when you want to. And this is really much more similar to how identity is in the real world. We all have the common way to think about identity is as a single static individual thing. That's really not the case. We don't have single identities. We all have many identities. We change based on who we're with and the context that we're in. We don't have a static, one true identity. We have a dynamic, ever-changing identity. And our identities aren't really completely our own. They are very social. They are really defined by our interactions and relationships. And this isn't me just saying this. This is, identity is a huge field in academia. This was the basis for the book I co-authored, and it's a very hard and nebulous field of study, but kind of those pieces are the very few things that are agreed upon across psychology and sociology and the many other fields that study this. And so thinking about identity as this very hard and fast thing, which we tend to do in the digital world because of security concerns, actually sets us up for failure. It sets us up for a system that doesn't make sense for our digital society. And it's also just much harder to get adoption. So we think kind of in every way, identity as this malleable graph that builds over time is a much better model. And so what this looks like is, you have this, conceptual identity, and you might attach many different keys or authentication methods to it. So you might have, for those of you who are kind of in the blockchain world, if you have MetaMask, you might have keys in MetaMask, you might have other keys from other networks beyond Ethereum, Bitcoin key, but you also might have a login with GitHub or a just email address and password. And if those have a way to manage keys, which there's now lots of solutions that do, each of those and kind of infinitely many of these different keys and different types of keys, basically anything that can sign an encrypted message, can become a linked authentication method to your identity. And then your identity can have, can point to a document that is basically your personal index, your identity index, which basically just contains its own pointers to lots of other information. So you might have a pointer to a profile that has your basic profile. And that profile might point to verifications that you own a certain Twitter handle or GitHub account. And there's lots of ways to kind of cryptographically prove that, and lots of different services where you can do that. And each of those can sign their own ceramic documents and sign their own, pieces of data. You might have other information defining your social graph, and your followers and your contacts. And you might have pointers to different data sources, so that, it's all the applications that you go use and where they're storing the data and your direct access to it. You might have preferred services, so that, you have a certain specified set of ways that you like to, you like email, or you like phone, or you like WhatsApp. Now every service doesn't kind of have their own, check the box for how you want them to get in touch with you. They just look at your linked information about your preferred services. You keep this all in one place connected to you, and you have this linked structure that you can update then that everybody can read from or request access to, instead of it being spread across many, many different places. And so we kind of have this identity-centric document graph that points to resources that are off the network and is anchored on the blockchain. And what this gives, and this is really, I think, what we were coming back to the whole time, is a really rich set of information and way to manage information for applications. Because now they can, get started off of all of this kind of set of information that already exists. Not only the data models and the way to manage information, the way that was true, previously, but also they can have direct access to the data that already exists that users choose to give about them. It's much more inherently interoperable than today. If you're an application today, you might be able to get users to give you access to their friends list on Facebook or on Twitter. But in that case, you're actually asking for access from Facebook. It's their server, they're controlling it, they're choosing to give you access only if you agree to use their data model and to use their terms. And they can turn that off anytime, as happened to, for example, Zynga, lost their business overnight because Facebook changed the terms of that API and shut off access. And so this is a guaranteed persistent model that applications can build on, can get more data from, and has much lower overhead. And so I think that is kind of the route to adoption of this. Is it's just better for applications and products and services online. And so what you end up with, if this is kind of, as this is more and more adopted, is this network of information where the information on it is very, very directly controlled by those who are participating in it. And that means it is collectively owned network effects. Everyone gets the benefit from the same network effects. If I'm an application, I get to draw on the network effects that already exist. And as I contribute new users and their data to this network, others get to benefit from that as well. And so we have a way to level the playing field and ensure this key resource information and the key way that it is kind of protected and used on the web is shared across all. And that has a whole bunch of really good benefits. So try to make this a little bit concrete. I don't want to go into demos of our or any partner's products. So I try to keep these pretty general. How can this actually be used today, especially? So really simple. To start with, completely interoperable profiles. So show up to an new application as soon as you log in. They have access to your profile. They don't need ask you to fill in the same form over and over and over. And so that's going to be for your basic profile and information, but it can be for your contact information. It can be for, I think any time that you fill in the same information over and over, now this can live in one place and they just read from it instead of having to recomplete it each time. A flexible yet unified login. So for those who don't use password managers, you might use single sign-on, log in with Google or Facebook or Twitter, how many different ones. And today, in almost all cases, which login you use, that is treated as your identity, which means that your entire experience once you log in is going to be different if you log in with a different method. And so you might have years of history logging in with your personal Gmail, and you come back to the app and you forget, you log in with your GitHub or your Twitter or Facebook. It has no idea who you are, and now you get a completely different experience. Now, small thing, but it's crazy that it works like that. And so the ability to attach multiple different ways that you might authenticate or identify yourself to the same underlying identity, if you want to, again, always your choice. Just a much more seamless experience across different applications. Again, smaller. So I think this is more powerful, portable social graph. So I have my followers, but these followers don't live on a database on Twitter or Facebook for them to leverage and build around, but instead any application can draw on the same social graph. So they don't have to overcome this really hard, cold start. If they're kind of a social application, they can draw on what already exists, and I don't have to recreate my connections on each new experience if I don't want to. So really deplatforming the graph, the network effects from any given interface or application. Open source data models. So you're an application and you kind of specify how you want to manage a certain type of data. You publish that data model on Ceramic. You maybe point to the data that exists. You reference some of the others that already exist, so you don't have to get started. This kind of looks like, developers today use open source code, so they don't have to recreate the same libraries. Well, the same can be true for how we manage information. And so others can have a much easier time getting started just reusing the data models and information management and the actual data itself that already exists. So just a much more efficient build process. So like being able to sync across devices, across applications, but even across applications, without kind of relying on any central server to do that, and no lock-in to continue doing it. And so, small example here, but if you again use MetaMask, you kind of have some information in there. They're using this kind of information network to sync the data across different MetaMask devices. And so they basically give you cloud backup and sync, but they're not actually using any given server. It's happening in a completely peer-to-peer way. But it also means another application can choose to request access to that data. And so say you have a contact list or a set of addresses that you're watching to get updates. That's no longer specific to MetaMask or any given application. Now others can draw on the same one. And so you really reduce the switching costs and the kind of extraction-based model that we've seen to date, because the ease of it going between applications and having them work together is so much higher. And it also means for applications, they're not kind of starting cold each time. We also just dramatically simplify the different applications and experiences we use online. This is true for both the developers building the products, but also for the users who are kind of on the other side of them. So today, you're kind of used to seeing interoperability of data because of the proliferation of APIs. You show up for one service and they request access to your kind of password for another. Sometimes they don't even request, they just kind of do it. And so you do have information traveling constantly between all of these different services because we demand that. We don't want to have to recreate as much information and have multiple different sources of truth that we have to reconcile. Way better experiences if our services are talking to each other, but it creates just this mess of access controls and connections between all of these different services. And you're actually getting kind of Metcalfe's law working towards complexity here, because as the number of different apps plugged into this ecosystem of connections grows, the number of connections you need grows exponentially, just like it is network effects, just kind of not in a beneficial way here. In a model where you've got direct management of information authored by users in an open place, you have one API, the user. The user shows up to your application, you look at their index, it points to a whole bunch of different data sources that you might find interesting for your application. You ask for access to them, they say yes or no, and you traverse the graph directly to them. It doesn't require dozens of different connections for different types of data. It requires one network that you go read and traverse. And so just much, much simpler. So over time, and this is some of you guys may have seen it kind of news about Solid and Interrupt in the last week. Solid is the project from Tim Berners-Lee, the founder of the internet, working on some similar things, a bit of a different model. And they've got a big pilot kicking off. And this is from kind of one of the lead architects on theirs. And I think a good kind of illustration of the shift of centralized web applications that has kind of your Facebook data stored with Facebook, and they have contact lists and pictures and agenda. LinkedIn has a separate contact list, and Doodle has your agenda, and you've kind of got these silos that maybe can talk to each other, but maybe can't. But even if they do, that's definitely not in your control, and it's definitely not really kind of easily scalable model. In this more decentralized model, again, we don't kind of subscribe exactly to how they do it, but again, I think it's a good illustration. You have your data is not stored with Facebook or LinkedIn or Doodle. You've got your pictures, you've got your agenda, you've got your contact list, and any given application can choose to look at them or request access to them to kind of deliver their experience. And so, again, much more, we use the word composable. You treat this information like Lego and build much better experiences. and without permission. So nearly at the end here, I'll just go through the rest and then we can take questions, but this is really just a recap. So I think the internet ushered in a new era for society. And again, I don't mean that lightly. I think it really did. It does kind of follow some trends we've seen in previous era changes, including this introduction of a new key resource that really has big effects on kind of the politics of how society is organized. And I think that key resource here is information. I think control of that information has let tech aggregators, those who kind of have dominated information management, rise into empires. And they've been able to kind of grow on these network effects that make it basically insurmountable today. And that to kind of shift the tenor and the kind of control of the internet, which I think is incredibly important, requires a new tool for managing information. I think that is the key piece that we need to, again, we had that poll about what resource really let them rise, and it's a lot of things. It is their scale, it is their capital, it is their brand, it is their ad supply. They have a lot of advantages, but I think it's their management of information and their information networks that is the key to it, and that doesn't make sense to have controlled just by a few companies. And I think that, we talked about information generally, but I really do think, it's decentralized identity that is the key that lets us co-author the web. These identifiers are what manages the information. They're what lets us each directly be co-authors of what happens online. And by each of us, I mean as users and as builders and as entrepreneurs, rather than outsource information management to other companies that have gotten really started and have built up big leads. We should be managing information directly and sharing it amongst ourselves directly. And these decentralized identifiers and the systems we build around them are the key to letting us do that and do that directly. And so just a few parting thoughts about what you can do with this information if you do find this compelling, besides ask questions and push on this, because there's a lot we still haven't figured out. One is to consider the network impact of the services you use. Anytime you choose what to use, and again, I use Google all the time. We shouldn't go boycott everything, but we often don't understand the sheer power of what's happening beneath the surface. And again, this isn't just about they're taking your data and monetizing it, and you should be mad. It's not about that. It's about it's every one new person and every one new piece of data and every piece of information has exponential value because it's how it is used together. And so when you're choosing things, just consider kind of what's happening under the hood. Resist lock-in. I think we should really demand portability from our products. I try never to use new products now that if I invest a lot in them, can extract a lot from me and I can't get away. And just really demand, whether it's using decentralized tech or just in their terms, demand that products and services change the model from this attract and then extract that we've seen. But then if you are excited about this tech, both what we talked about today, but also the last couple of months, experiment, either if you're a product person or a designer or an engineer, actually kind of experiment and build. But even if you just, experiment in your mind, what you'd like to see when data and network effects can be shared across apps. It's a really new model. Even those of us who work in it all the time, we have lots of examples we like to share, but the really powerful ones are not going to emerge until it's more common. And you can do new things that you really couldn't do before. And so the ideas that come from all of you about what you'd like to see is what's going to power kind of the visions and the products that take off and start to drive this usage. So that's it from me. And again, happy to take any more questions if there are some.
Hey, Danny, actually, there is a question here in the chat, and we ask for folks to put their questions in the chat. There's a question here. It says, can you talk a little more technically about how you transact the payload? Is the signature in the transaction or sign prior to the transaction What does verification look like? What does bulk payload look like? Or how do you think about multiple assertions in a single transaction? And it's in the chat, Danny, if you'd like to take a look at it. But that's the question from Martin.
Cool, yeah. Yep. So let me pull this up. Okay, so Martin, let me kind of try to give a little bit of information, but then feel free to jump in if I didn't answer your question. So it's a local first model. And so, it's going to be different for different types of information. And I should say there are certain things today that just require a centralized service. There's not yet a discovered way to do it peer-to-peer. But for, say you're making kind of let's make it very concrete, but say you go to an application and you're kind of making an update to the information as a user, you're changing your profile, you're filling out a profile. That information is signed locally, client side, by whatever. So the way that we actually manage having many different keys or logins and one identifier is the identity has a seed. That seed is encrypted to each of the kind of linked authentication methods, so they each have access to that seed. And so whichever one you have kind of loaded in your browser or on your phone is used to sign a message or kind of sign the information that's going into a document update. And then those, I think you asked about verification. So, verification looks different depending on, again, the use case, but it's mostly just like it's all encryption based and kind of reading signatures. The bulk payload, if that means so again, our model is a little different than like the kind of assertion based model that I think is really common in other identity providers. So I'm not sure what this refers to, but like there are kind of ways to do kind of more bulk queries of information and verify them. But it's an open network, so that can be done in different ways. There's not like one single way. And then the bulk payload, again, what we basically are doing is like, I think I skipped a slide that I can send around later that kind of has the anatomy of a ceramic document, but each update is submitted by nodes to an anchoring service. The anchoring service basically batches them up and puts them in a Merkle tree and then takes the hash of that and puts it on chain. So again, I'm not sure if I talked directly to what you were asking about. Feel free to jump in if not, but those are a few of the pieces.
No, that makes sense. So we work in the K-12 space, and so we have many assertions of education events. So you have courseware, you have I completed this document, and so I was just curious about how there's a lot of assertion-based chain architectures right now that say every assertion is a single credential per se, and then you have to verify each credential. And so we're kind of focused on how do we get as much data in a single package, but then be able to break it back out. And so that was kind of the foundation of my question is, how do you handle that thought process?
Yeah. So one thing I should clarify, I guess, is and by the way, I used to be in the education space too. So these are some use cases that I think about quite a bit. We don't view verified credentials and like signed proofs coming from an institution or a peer, I think are incredibly important. That is often the focus of others in the space working on decentralized identity, is this idea of like accumulating credentials and then how once you have them, are they kind of verified as still valid? And that is not the focus of the network we're building. That kind of is very complementary, but you could, for example, have in your identity index, kind of your index of information, you could point to a document that has credential, your kind of list of credentials, and that could be stored on Ceramic, and you could have verified credentials there. But it could also point to like a Hyperledger data hub, which is something that Drummond, I think, has maybe referenced a couple of weeks ago, and that would have its own credentials, and that would have a way, there would be kind of a way to verify those from this signed piece of data, actually like go traverse, who issued it. And so that's kind of like a complementary piece to this more than directly what we're focused on.
So yours is more directly aligned to kind of the IDFS model of just storage and then verification and logging and auditing those chunks of data. Is that a way to think about it?
Yeah, it's like mapping and routing to all of this different information. Some information is going to be signed in different ways. If it's, for example, coming from an educational institution, depending on what they've used, then kind of the verification might be different. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
Thanks.
Thanks for sharing that, Danny. And Martin, thank you so much for that question. Thanks for joining us and asking that question. Danny, the questions are starting to roll in. So next question is from David. It says, moving to new standards, as you note, need a network effect. Right now, most people do know/care about SSI. How do you jumpstart this process? What is the best case application or use case that you see driving adoption? And David, please feel free to clarify your question.
Yeah, I realized there was a typo. I said most people don't know or care about SSI. My question is, how do you make them care? Let's say a developer creates an application with Ceramic today. Most people can't consume that. Most businesses can't consume that. How do you get them to care and build applications themselves?
Yeah, I mean, this is the hardest thing, is especially with very new tech that does have limitations, or at least has had very real limitations compared to what's been, built up over decades now. Why would people make the switch? And I agree with you that most people don't care about SSI. This is a hypothesis. This is purely kind of the opinion of myself and others at Ceramic, but we think it's going to be developer-led and kind of application-led more than user-led. We think that demand from users to take back more privacy, and that is definitely rising, and that's great. And pushing in that direction is going to be necessary. But it's increasingly a liability for developers and a huge overhead for developers to be managing personal data, especially, but also just like information generally. And even when you're building on some of these more established architectures, it's still not as easy as it should be. And one of the kind of trends across web development is just higher and higher levels of abstraction, no-code tools and Jamstack and app builders. But each of those abstract up by like hiding making a whole bunch of decisions lower in the stack, or like reducing functionality, or just making things more rigid. And so one of the things that we think we can do with this technology today is make it much lighter weight to build a much more powerful application, because you still need to like decide on your data model and publish it and kind of, configure it early on, but then you don't need to manage it in an ongoing way, and others can draw on it, and you can draw on others. And so that we think that kind of a rise of direct information management and SSI will come about largely as a result of that choice by application developers, not vice versa.
Interesting. I see. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I just open question. I wonder what that parallels to a historical event. When was there a time where change was driven by the raw materials, I guess, versus the end user? I'm going to think about that.
Thanks for that, David.
Yeah, that's an interesting frame. Thanks for that, David. Yeah.
Thank you.
Danny, the next question comes in from Andrew. He says, I appreciated your political historical approach. Do you see your project of helping to bring along the democratization of information as a kind of Fukuyama end of history? That is, does this end of cycle of empires arising to dominate resources, or do we slide back into the process again when a new important resource comes along? And Andrew, please feel free to clarify anything you feel you need to there. And it's all yours.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I'm not familiar with the Fukuyaman end of history. Maybe I should be, but I don't think this is the end. One of our very early supporters, he was an investor in the kind of early days of the web, and foresaw a lot of what has played out with these large tech platforms 10, 12, 15 years ago. He's always saying, okay, like he's looking for what is the re-centralization vector? Because there's always going to be a way to that emerges to re-centralize power, and I think that's going to be endless. And so, yeah, no, I don't think it's the end of history. I don't even know that I hope it's the end of history, because we do need these cycles to kind of bring about new powerful resources and move on. But I think it's an important evolution in this phase that we're in.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Danny. Next question is from Ryan. Ryan, actually, Ryan, I saw you on video. Why don't I let you go ahead and ask your question there?
Hey, thanks, Timothy. So, by the way, Danny, love the presentation. I can't think of the last time that a presentation went an hour and I stay engaged for the full hour. So that was well done. I really enjoyed the history, and then also, sort of just what your company is doing today. And not to sound like a contrarian, as a matter of fact, I'm very much an advocate of what we're talking about here today. But I also think, so what I put in, I'll just read the question. You talked about the agrarian age, the control of property, the industrial age, control of resources, and the information age, which is control of information. I think for many people, it's not self-evident that losing control of our data is the existential threat that not having property or resources was. And so I think in that way, people can go on today living life not having their data, and they're perfectly comfortable with that. So how do you make the argument to people? I guess what I said here is, what is the real threat of not reclaiming control of our data? And again, as somebody who doesn't even love pictures of my kids on Facebook, I'm a huge advocate of reclaiming our data. But I think for the vast majority of people, it's a really hard sell, especially as we get further down. We see some other questions where we talk about revenue streams that are being eliminated, which are going to result in additional cost to consumer, et cetera. That's a tough sell. So I'll stop there.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I think you're completely right. I do think it's great that there's more and more awareness of the problems of losing control of our data, but I don't think that that's the framing that properly paints like what's actually going on, because of exactly what you said. Even for those of us who care a lot about it, data is it's this like commodity. We can kind of throw it away and there's new data later, and like, what's the real damage? But I think that what gets lost in all of the talk about loss of control of our data is this concept that I've tried to think of as information management. It's not just data; it's kind of it's a level of abstraction higher about who gets to decide what we see, how we see it, when we see it, when we're online, at the lowest levels. Because I come back to like, it's really hard to, even if they didn't keep all of your data and abuse it, and they were like, great guardians of your personal data, we still have a situation where you have to use these large tech companies and the infrastructure that they provide, and they, by virtue of their control, because of how much power they have and their legal obligation to maximize shareholder value, they have to make choices about what information gets showed when online, that change. Like, you can't be neutral. It's always a decision. Do you show everything in a Twitter feed, or do you have an algorithm that changes to show a certain other thing? And they are always going to be bent towards showing the thing that maximizes profit. Maybe not 100%, maybe they dial it back for certain reasons, but they're always going to be bent towards that. And because these platforms are the infrastructure of our digital society, we're in the situation where our society, I don't think it's a perfect image, but there's that kind of playing field. I have this image of like, we're on this platform, we can't get off of it, it's where we have to live. But that platform is inherently designed not to be a good place for us to connect and interact and build value. It's designed to extract as much value out of us as it possibly can while persisting. And to me, that's the danger, is we have this digital society that's not meant to be a society. It's built to be a money and power generation machine for a few companies. And that's just not a tenable situation going forward.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great observation. And I like that you used the term revolution earlier, because it does, in many ways, I think it's going to take a revolution, an awakening and realization for people that's almost a strong religious belief. And people will have to see it as being plugged into the matrix, right? We and our data are what are making this machine go. And as long as people don't feel like that's an issue, I don't think that you're going to be able to reach that critical mass. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, and in that sense, we may be at the still at the beginning stages of that. It'll be interesting to see how we progress. But I know there's other questions. I'll stop.
Ryan, that was
Thanks,
awesome.
Ryan.
Awesome question. Thank you. And Danny, thank you so much for that answer. I mean, the historical perspective that you introduced is really fascinating. My question, I tossed one out there, but I'm gonna skip over it because you talked about SSI a little bit, and I'll kind of I'm hoping that maybe we'll hear it. You talk about it through some other questions. I was just simply interested in your thoughts on the role of SSI and the future of the web. You know, you made a really great statement earlier where you said that new information and identity technologies will let us reclaim our web. And so when you mentioned SSI earlier, and I think it came up from David's question, that was, can you just share some thoughts really quickly maybe on the future and kind of the role you think SSI will play?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's actually some debate going on even in the SSI community about how to think of it. And my view is that we should all ultimately have the choice to directly control information about ourselves and our presence online. I don't think everybody will choose that. You know, the very strict sense of SSI is you control the keys that control your identity, and no one else has them. I think plenty of people will choose to trust third-party services, and you know, whether it's a bank or Google or whoever else, to kind of manage control because security is tough. And so when I think of SSI, I think of like ultimately you could choose it, but you might not choose to. And I also think of SSI not as like this one identity that kind of controls everything, or one kind of root identity that controls other identities. I think of it as the ability to kind of manage your web of information. And that can be credentials from education institutions and the government. It could be self-attested personal information and a way for kind of others to look to you for that and not have it scattered everywhere. But it also is your browsing history. It's also your social graph. It's also all of the things that just are naturally generated when we interact online. The analogy I use, but also I don't think there's like a unilateral right to control everything about yourself online the way that like some people interpret the right to be forgotten. The analogy I use, like if you think about a kind of typical, you know, physical world, you know, town or society, what was identity in that context? You go into a bar, you meet someone, you have a relationship. The bar doesn't own that relationship, you own that relationship. You go to your church and you have a bunch of other relationships, and that's separate. Maybe it's related, but you might be a different person there. You might have a different persona. You might use a different name, even a nickname in the bar and a name there. These are all yours, but you also can't go back to the bar and get drunk and thrown out and make everybody forget that, right? Like you can't force everyone to take to kind of subscribe to exactly how you view yourself. And that's kind of how I view the future of digital identity going, is like today we don't have anything close to that because the bar or like Facebook owns your relationship with your friends in the bar. Like you can't take those with you. They own that. We need to move to a world where those experiences, that data, those relationships, that social graph, those personas, you get to manage those and shape those. But it is a very social thing, which is why we take this view of kind of a web of information, not an identity wallet or vault with information, because inherently a lot of this stuff is social. And so the last thing I'll say here is that I think a critical part of SSI is not just about the information we are gathering and controlling about ourselves, but our ability to write and directly manage this information that's happening on the web, to be the authors of it, and not outsource that to others. And that goes for kind of people and for projects and for companies, to kind of collectively be the authors of data, not the hoarders of it.
Oh, yeah. We've got another follow-up question to that, actually. It sounds like building off of an earlier question. what future scenarios do you worry about, and what would deal a death blow to these efforts? This question comes in from Barnaby.
That's a good question. So, I mean, most of my worries are just about, it's pretty new tech that we're building with, all of the pieces coming together and how they're coming together. So the biggest scenario that I worry about is just like how long it takes to kind of build really performant, really reliable, really good infrastructure and tech that does enough to get adoption. If we look kind of further out about like how it goes wrong, I think that it's all encryption based. And so quantum computing that can break encryption means privacy is gone. I think that, there's work that's can mitigate that. And that feels a little far out to me still, but maybe it's not. The regulation, GDPR and CCPA and others wasn't written with this technology in mind. And so there's pieces of, ways to read some of these very important regulations that kind of makes a lot of what's being done on these encrypted public networks kind of in the spirit of, but against the letter of regulation. And so I don't know that that'd be a death blow, but it would be a setback. I think we're going to have setbacks and we're going to have advances. I think that I and a lot of us who work in this space are pretty convinced this is the future because it's just such a better model. It's just a question of how we get there. I guess one scenario I worry a lot about is, and this isn't directly related to what we talked about today, but some of these large companies are very interested in this technology. So Twitter has talked about it a lot. Facebook has Libra. I'm very worried about if Libra catches on and Facebook has a view into basically every financial transaction in addition to their social graph and advertising graph. And they have been quite dodgy on some questions about the portability of that. And so I worry about the privacy implications of that. That might make this tech take off, but not in the way that we want it to.
No, awesome. And I had one last follow-up. And that was, you mentioned building better systems starts with a better, more distributed offering. Is there a consensus, on this within tech, or is this a challenged concept?
Sorry, let me pull up the question because I lost you for a second there. I'm not seeing it in the chat. Can you say that one more time, Timothy?
Yep, I just dropped it in the chat, so it's there now. The question
there
was,
we go.
Yep, there you
go. So, no, I mean, I think that distributed offerings have, there's definite downsides to them. So I'm not sure I'd say it's like consensus that this will be adopted everywhere, but even centralized companies are adopting distributed systems because they need to. It's just a question of like where, what's distributed and how. So I think that the reason a better system for the web needs to be distributed is because I think the web is really our digital society. And I don't think a society can be governed by, or should be governed by a few corporations, a few dictators. I think it needs to be distributed politically. Now, whether that translates to distributed tech under the hood, there's other solutions, but I think distributed tech under the hood is the most core way to get at distributed governance, authorship, and ownership of the web.
Thank you for that, Danny. Looks like we've got no more questions. This was really great for me. I learned a lot today. This was super awesome. Danny, thank you so much, for being here and sharing this space time with us. I know Ryan had one last question, but it looked like you covered it. Ryan, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
No, we're good. This is great discussion. Thanks so much, Danny and Timothy, both for making this happen.
Well, thanks for joining us, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Danny, wanted to just give you a moment if you had any concluding comments. I thought this was absolutely fantastic.
No, this was fun. Thanks for having me. The last thing I'll say is my contact info is here. Some contact info for what we're building is here. Please reach out if you have questions, if you have additional thoughts. Some of those questions, I think we all took some, some thoughts to ponder going forward. So keep the conversation going and feel free to drop by if you want to see what we're building or follow along. We're trying to do it as much in the open as possible.
Thanks so much, Danny, and we hope that you guys will come back and share more with us as you find more. I mean, there's going to be tons of aha moments that you're having, and you just shared some of them with us here today. Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone, and everyone have a fantastic evening. Thanks again, Danny.
Thanks all.